And again, that is showing a lot of variation within our country. And then there's also variation of that trend across our country. Here you see it county by county. This is mapping the Gini index, which is an indicator of inequality. So the lighter colors are more equal counties, and the darker colors are more unequal counties in terms of income. And you can see that that's very variable as well. So just reminders that we're working with some major trends that are felt globally, but we all are experiencing them locally in different ways. So how can we think about these trends in terms of how they're affecting our gardens? Well, there's a model that I find very useful, and we'll look at it applied to this graph of July temperature in Bakersfield, California. So this includes both observed and projected temperatures in that location. And you can see, we're just showing from 1960, but you can see that that line is clearly a positive trend line, so that temperature is going to be rising quite significantly over time. So one way to think about this is to look at it in terms of our response capacity. So if we imagine, for example, that we grow tomatoes in our garden in the summertime, and we are used to growing them in pretty warm summers in Bakersfield. And when it starts getting a little bit hotter, well, we notice that the fruit set might not be so good. So we start maybe shading our plants, maybe mulching a little bit more. And we work within that range below the lower dotted line. We're coping with the changes. We're coping with the variation that might be more frequent than we are used to in the past, but it's still sort of familiar, and we have methods to address it. But as that temperature keeps climbing and the fruit set slows down more and more, we're going to be moving into a new area. We're going to be moving into a phase where we have to find new strategies, and we have to maybe even find new materials. Maybe we have to look for more heat tolerant varieties. Maybe we have to do more intensive shading. We have to change some of our methods to respond adequately to make our gardens still be productive and meaningful for us. As that trend continues in temperature, we're going to cross a threshold, and that, these thresholds depend on where you are and what you're growing, and the variable, the temperature, for example, or frost, or whatever's of concern to you. But as the temperature climbs, in this example, we cross that next threshold, and we move into a zone where we can't adapt. There's nothing we can do to adapt. We have to either completely transform our system, or we become vulnerable and we can't garden. So we could perhaps transform our system by saying, okay, the only thing I'm going to tend in the summertime are my nopal cactus. And I'll tend those, and I'll try and get some pads off of them. I'm going to give up on tomatoes and other fruiting vegetables. Maybe basil will be all right, but not tomatoes. So by laying this out, I find it very useful for thinking about the kind of changes we're experiencing. And this is the kind of model that policymakers also use in thinking about us in terms of community and state and national and global level experience of change. So we're moving from our coping range into the adaptation and perhaps even transformation range. And what we want to do is we want to expand our response capacity, expand our ability to still successfully garden, in this case, under these conditions. Checking our time, my goodness. Okay. So the strategy for doing this that we propose in our book is one that uses some very simple methods to expand our response capacity. We observe, we experiment because we want to understand what's happening. We want to have evidence so that we can understand and have a credible way to move forward with our next steps in gardening. And we work together. And those three simple methods are very, very powerful for addressing these kinds of challenges. And we can also use basic concepts, basic scientific concepts about the components that underpin gardening. And by using concepts instead of recipes, which I would say something like plant spacing might be a recipe, the concept that you would want to understand would be what type of root growth do your crops have? Because if you follow a recipe, those recipes typically don't take into account that you might want to intercrop, or that in your location you could perhaps plant more densely, or you might need to plant more widely. So recipes are fantastic, but if you want to be working on developing new responses, the concepts are very valuable. And I just put in two images from two community-based initiatives that are doing these kinds of explorations here in California, One Seed, One Community, and the Bishop Paiute Tribe's Food Sovereignty Program. So an example with water use in the garden, with climate change, we need to be conserving water. There's going to be less irrigation water available. Precipitation will be more erratic and more intense and be harder to store water. So water conservation is really important. So if we have very heavy clay soils in our garden, and we notice that when we irrigate, the water is sort of pulled laterally, it's not sinking in, we might be losing a lot to evaporation as it's moving very slowly through the soil, pulled by water potential. We would try to look for a way to use subsurface irrigation. And one of the best ways that I know of, and the most cost-effective, is to use vertical mulch. So that's simply, as in the diagram, simply placing something like corn stalks or sugarcane stalks or sorghum stalks into the ground. You can pour the water into that, and that allows the water to just move rapidly with gravity instead of soil water potential right down to the root zone. Another way to respond is to rethink what we mean when we say yield and productivity, because typically we think of yields and productivity in terms of area of land. And we want to maximize how much productivity we can get from an area of land. But as you can see from the graph in the lower right part of the screen, we can also think about productivity per unit of water. And that peaks before productivity from land. And so after that peak that you see there, each new unit of water will produce less than the previous units did up until that high point. And so we can think about yields in terms of water use efficiency, in terms of the amount of water we're applying, and maybe water a little bit less, maybe notice when our plants are looking good, and maybe let them get just a little bit drought stressed, so that then we can add water and keep them producing the maximum for the amount of water they're receiving. And the other way we can respond in terms of water management is how we organize ourselves. And so social organization is really a very, very powerful way to conserve resources and to ensure that they're equitably distributed, both in space now, but also in time in terms of future generations. And there are studies, recently a study out of UC Santa Cruz that found, comparing community gardens where there are rules about water use with others where there are not, that those with rules made better use of water, were more conservative with water use, even when the gardeners in both gardens were very, very concerned and wanting to conserve water. When you don't have rules that help minimize your use, it's very hard to conserve in some cases. So social organization is really important. I'm going to keep going really quickly and then we'll see where we are. So the next example I want to talk about is with seeds. And I want to preface it by telling you a story that really connects with the previous example of social organization making good use of water. And that was an experience that I had. My husband and I worked for a number of years for the Pueblo of Zuni with a sustainable agriculture project. And that project included a folk varieties project to conserve and support the use of traditional Zuni seeds by the Pueblo of Zuni. Excuse me. And when we got started, there had been some early efforts to work toward having a seed bank at the Pueblo of Zuni. And as we worked more and more with our Zuni colleagues and discussed it and looked at budgets and people's times, it was evident that maintaining a seed bank, which I'm sure a number of you are well aware, takes a lot of time and resources often. You have grow outs to do, you have a lot of tasks related to maintaining a good seed bank. So we realized that that wouldn't be possible. And in discussions, we came upon the idea of a seed network. So there would be no physical collection, but we would have a list in the tribal office of people who had seeds and which seeds were available. And they would give those to the project, and we could put up the list of varieties that were available. And then people would come and write down their name and varieties that they wanted. And so through the project, we were able to connect people to seeds that they were looking for. So someone would come and bring seeds to us, to the project, and someone else who wanted them could come and get them from the project. And our colleague, Andy Latte, a very accomplished Zuni farmer, when we were developing this idea together, he said, yeah, this is going to work because there are some families here who my family doesn't really have much to do with, and we wouldn't give them seeds directly, and I don't think they'd come and ask us. But I'm happy to let the project give them seeds, and I would be really happy to get some seeds that I'm missing from other families that might have them as well. And so this was a way, it sort of depersonalized these seed systems and allowed the size of the seed system to grow and to include more people that didn't have to rely on close personal connections. And in many ways, that's what you're doing. Those of you that have seed libraries, you're sort of expanding the personal, completely informal seed system into a sort of semi-formal one where people can connect through the institution of a seed library. So seed libraries, I think, as you can tell from that story, I think are really important, and they're really valuable for expanding our response capacity in the face of these changes. So I wanted to just give a quick description of seed libraries. They really don't know much about them. They haven't been studied very much. I did a quantitative survey